Yeah, we're live. Welcome, everybody. Second edition today for the FAIR Institute Risk Analysis on Risk Quantification. With me today again, Ivan Milenkovic and Jack Jones. I'm going to hand it over to Ivan very quickly because we've got a lot to cover. So I'll reduce my part to just a disclaimer. We're going to cover a lot of information today, and it's all going to make a lot of sense when Jack is explaining it. And then you're going to try and do it within your own organization, and that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. Don't worry about it. Just let it come over you. The video of this webinar will be sent to all of you, as well as the presentation and maybe even some of the questions that you have for today that we could not cover like you did last time, Jack, if that's okay with you. And we're gonna supply you with a lot of information that will help you should you want to implement this within your own organization. I think you're all familiar with Livestorm right now. Just to make sure, at the right bottom, the question tab, click on it. Ask your questions. Ivan is licensed to make the interruption with Jack today, or decide to save that question for the end of the webinar. Ivan, handing it over to you.
Thank you, Wim. Hi, everybody. Fantastic to have you here again. Around a month ago, we were here in a very similar setup with Jack, who I don't think I need to introduce, really, a father of the FAIR model. Last time we covered some of the basics when it comes to cyber risk quantification. It was a light touch on the FAIR itself to some extent. And obviously, by popular demand, many of you requested us to kind of try to make some of those things a bit more tangible and put them in a context of real examples. Therefore, this is exactly what we're trying to do for you today. Jack prepared a fantastic story on how and why to do some of those things. So without further ado, Jack, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here, and let's dive right in. So you may recall from the last session that we had these two security-related findings that had been qualitatively rated, both rated as high risk. And the question is, well, are they equally risky, or is one fundamentally more important? And in fact, are they truly high risk? And I said in the last session that one, in fact, represents an order of magnitude more risk than the other, roughly. And so we're going to walk through analysis of both of these and see how those results were arrived at. And let's dive in. But before we get into those two scenarios, what we didn't cover in the last session was how you treat data, and especially subject matter expert estimates, which is very often what we're left with, for data. I mean, in many cases, we just, as an industry, we just don't have the data we need for some of the variables. And that's just the nature of the beast, and that's true whether we're doing quantitative or qualitative measurements. People tend to think of data as being sort of a quantitative problem, but it is in fact a problem for qualitative measurements as well. So we're going to cover that briefly here within the context of quantitative analysis. And that'll make the analyses as we go through them make more sense to you. So first off, again, two points that Douglas Hubbard makes in his presentations and books. And if you're not familiar with Douglas Hubbard, I highly encourage you to look into his work. It's frankly amazing. And he has these 2 points that he makes, and that he can empirically prove these to be true through various methods, and has many times. We have more data than we think we do, and we need less data than we think we do to do quantitative analysis. And this is really important because there are a lot of misconceptions about data and quantitative analysis. I hear over and over again people saying, well, we don't have enough data to do quantitative analysis, and that's just fundamentally untrue. And so we'll see some examples of this as we go through the analysis, but wanted to sort of plant that seed. Another is sort of this question of uncertainty in measurements, especially when we're dealing with subject matter expert estimates. And so what I oftentimes do in presentations is live presentations where I'm in front of the audience. I'll point to someone in the audience and ask them, how tall do you think I am? And they'll throw out a number, 6 foot tall or 5'10" or whatever the case might be. And then I'll ask them, would they be willing to bet $1,000 on that value? And they always, of course, say no. I said, well, can you give me a range, between, a minimum and a maximum for my height that you would bet $1,000 on? And then they give it a thought and they go, okay, maybe 5'5" to 6'4". And I say, okay, so you bet $1,000 on that? And they say, yeah, okay. Let's make it more interesting. Give me a range you'd bet your life on. And after a moment's thought, they give me a wider range, maybe 1 foot tall to 10 feet tall, right? They'd bet their life on that. And what's interesting and important to recognize about what just transpired is that between that first value they gave me that they weren't willing to bet anything on, okay, or at least not willing to bet $1,000 on, they've now made an estimate that they'd be willing to bet their life on. And they don't have better data. They have exactly the same data that they had originally. The only difference is they are now in a position to express their uncertainty by giving this range, right? And that's a critical point to understand about subject matter expert estimates. They should never be point values. They should always be ranges or distributions, because there is always uncertainty, and it is crucial to faithfully represent the uncertainty in a measurement. And this is always true. Even if you're operating from, terabytes of empirical data, there's still uncertainty. And it might be very small, but you should still represent that in your measurements, both the inputs and the outputs. So, the bottom line here is when we're making measurements about cybersecurity risk, regardless of the variable, we almost always do so using a range or distribution. We'll see that as we go through the rest of it. Now, there's a very specific process, there's a very specific process, and it can take different forms for arriving at those estimates. So let's say we're estimating the wingspan of a Boeing 747, and we can't look it up on Google, let's say. So we give an initial estimate of 1 to 1,000 feet, okay? Pretty confident it's somewhere in there. That's an estimate I would bet my life on. And that should always be sort of the starting point for a subject matter expert estimate in this calibration process we're stepping through right now. You start with an estimate you're dead certain on. And then in this example of how you sort of evolve from there, you have a wheel with 90% of the surface area is white and 10% is red. You spin that pointer, and if it lands in the white, you win $1,000. So you can bet on the wheel, where you have a 90% chance of winning $1,000, or you can bet on your range. Well, in this case, I'm going to bet on my range. I'm 100% confident in my range. So I'm not betting on the wheel. Well, then I begin to refine that estimate, narrow it, right, down to 50 to 500 feet. And I might be looking for data. I might be thinking about rationale that would help me to, defend these values. And then I ask myself again, would I bet on my range or would I bet on the wheel? I'm still going to bet on the wheel. So then I continue to narrow it. And each time I narrow it, it gets a little less comfortable betting on the range. The wheel begins to look more attractive as a bet. But let's say here, a football field, American football field, 300 feet long. I'm confident that Boeing wingspan is less than that, but my driveway is 100 feet long, and I'm pretty confident that the wingspan is more than that. So I'm going to still bet on my range. Now I refine it some more, and I'm going, okay, at this point, I'm more confident in either I'm more confident in the wheel, or I can't choose between them. Either way, at this point, we're approximately 90% confident in our range, right? So this is the kind of process, and there are variations on this, that you can go through to arrive at what's known as a calibrated estimate. And it's been proven empirically to be very good at improving the quality and accuracy of estimates. So again, just an example, and been using this for years. By the way, this process comes from Douglas Hubbard and his work. So again, something for you to look into. All right. And then the last point on this is, people oftentimes will say, well, if you don't have a statistically significant amount of data, which they can virtually never define what that means, you're just guessing. Well, no, there's a pretty big difference in my mind between a guess and an estimate. An estimate is something you would place a meaningful bet on, and a guess is something that you wouldn't. So in that, example regarding my height, the person's first value they threw out, 5'10" or 6 foot or whatever, that was a guess. They weren't willing to place a meaningful bet on it. By the end, they gave me a range that was an estimate, right? And they probably put a little more thought into what those numbers were, and again, they were willing to place a meaningful bet on it. So anyway, that's, in my mind, an effective way to think about guessing versus estimation. And again, remember, there's always uncertainty. If you're waiting for a perfect value, perfectly precise and always accurate value in any estimate of anything complex or meaningful, you're going to die of old age before you get that number. So there's always uncertainty, and ranges and distributions are an important way to deal with that. So let's dive into these analyses. All right, the first one we're going to cover is that inappropriate access privilege scenario. So what data do we need? Well, we refer to the FAIR ontology, the FAIR model, and we need these, at the very least, these values. Now, FAIR goes to deeper levels of abstraction in the model, but very often you can operate at sort of this level of abstraction and not get into the weeds. There's a time and a place to get into the weeds, but generally you don't have to. And so these are the data points we'll be going after. So, but before we can gather data, we have to scope the analysis. We have to have clarity on what it is we're measuring in the first place. So what's the asset at risk? Well, it's customer information in this case. What are the threat actors? Well, it's personnel with inappropriate access. Okay, and remember that, because that's going to come back to us. What type of action? Well, we could choose malicious or accidental. I mean, someone with inappropriate access could accidentally delete something or change something that they shouldn't have, right? Because they have inappropriate access. So, but that's a different scenario than something that's malicious, right? So we have to choose. We can't munge those things together because their probabilities are different. Very often, the magnitudes can be different and that sort of thing. So we have to choose, right? That's part of getting risk measurement right, is having clarity and specificity on what you're measuring. What type of event is it? Is it a confidentiality disclosure sort of event or theft? Is it a data integrity, or is it an availability thing? Again, it could be any of those, but they're different in terms of their likelihoods and their impacts. So we have to choose, right? We have to, in defining what it is we're analyzing, we have to choose one. And for our scenario, we're going to choose confidentiality. And so given that, we have this is the loss event scenario, the risk that we're measuring. Confidentiality of customer data is maliciously compromised by personnel with inappropriate access, right? Now we can begin measuring. Without this, I don't care if you're measuring quantitatively or qualitatively. Without this, the odds of getting it right go way the heck down with measurement, all right? Scoping is not a quantitative thing, it's a risk measurement thing, all right? So threat event frequency. All right, so this is that first node in the FAIR model that we have to go after data. And so there's the definition of threat event frequency there. And so now we start thinking about and talking about what data do we have or rationale do we have to formulate numbers from, right? So we know that in this case, there were 30 user accounts out of 200 that had access privileges they shouldn't have, okay? HR records, we talked to HR and we said, all right, over the last 3 years, 2 people had been caught snooping, okay? And so it might be tempting to say, okay, that gives us a, a threat event frequency of every year and a half or so. But that wouldn't be true, because these people that did this, these are people with the access they were supposed to have. They were part of that larger population, right? 170 accounts that had access they were supposed to have. So with a smaller population of potential threat actors, you have to account for that smaller population and sort of calibrate, if you will, your estimate from this. This is still useful, but it kind of helps us to set a maximum, and recognizing that we're going to have to step back from that maximum value too, because it's a smaller population. And I already said that. So after conversations with the subject matter experts in this organization, and of course after that conversation with HR, and those weren't, in fact, I'm glad I had this point in here. Something else to moderate that value from is these weren't malicious acts. These were inappropriate acts, but they weren't stealing data. They weren't doing anything other than looking at stuff they didn't have any reason to look at. All right. So the point here is that malicious misuse is statistically far less likely than just sort of this curiosity sort of thing. So again, that further reduces the threat event frequency from whatever we might have assumed given 2 events of misuse in 3 years. So, in this first scenario, the other thing I'll say is we're going to measure this both qualitatively and quantitatively, so you get a sense of some of the differences. So qualitatively, we'd have to say, at least I would say, given sort of my internal model of how I would label frequencies qualitatively, I would say this is certainly a low frequency event, okay? If it's less than once every year and a half, probably a lot less than once every year and a half, that to me is low, right? Now, if you're going to measure things qualitatively, it can be really helpful, in fact, important, to set ranges for what low means or what medium means or what high means. But stop to think about that for a second. When you do that, you're now kind of doing quantitative measurement anyway, right? So something to think about. So the group that did this analysis, they said, given this data, they said the minimum is once in 20 years. And what they mean by that is they believe that given these circumstances, we should expect that at least once in every 20 years, somebody in this group of 30 accounts would do something malicious with this data because of the inappropriate access privileges. They said maximum of 5 per year. Now that seems like a very high number, given what I just talked about regarding data and rationale. But when you stop and think about it, you may not always know when this kind of event happens. Okay, so sort of a known unknown. And so the maximum value is an expression of there's stuff we don't know here. It could be going on. It's probably not. But we're going to set this maximum value to sort of reflect our paranoid selves. Okay. But what's important about that is in the process of doing this, they discovered they really didn't have good logging on what these accounts were doing, right? They only retained logs for 90 days. And there was no evidence of anything malicious going on the 90-day logs that they had. But if they had, say, a year's worth of logs, they could have gone back and dramatically improved the quality of their estimates here, right? And had a lot more confidence in it, a narrower range and that sort of thing. Or not, maybe, maybe they'd learned there's a lot of stuff going on. But they, again, the process of going through this identified this deficiency in their visibility into their threat landscape, and they went out and changed that immediately. So this is an example of an opportunity. Doing an analysis leads to an opportunity to improve our security and our ability to make well-informed decisions going forward. And then the most likely value, they said once in every 10 years. Okay. So that was the distribution, the minimum, maximum, and most likely value that they derived from this. Okay. And they went through the process, that calibration process that we stepped through a few moments ago. So that's the first data point. Second data point is susceptibility. All right. This is, or vulnerability, same thing. Which is the likelihood that if a threat actor, in this case, one of those users of one of those accounts chose to act maliciously, would they be able to? And this one's easy because the problem is these are privileged insiders. The whole reason we're doing the analysis is because they have the ability to do malicious acts like this if they chose to. So we're going to qualitatively say very high susceptibility to the attack if someone chooses to behave maliciously. And we're going to just say 100%. When the way I approach sort of privileged insider scenarios is I assume, well, they're privileged, so we're 100% susceptible, right? So this data point's really easy to arrive at. Okay. Now we get into loss magnitude. And in FAIR, we have primary loss magnitude, and as it says here, that's loss that occurs, anytime the event takes place. Okay, and it would include, in this case, forensics or investigative costs. We have to replace the malicious employee, right? Those are sort of at least a couple of values. And qualitatively, we're going to characterize that as moderate. Again, this is, hopefully you're beginning to see where, one person's moderate might be another person's higher, another person's low, right? So that's where clearly defining what a qualitative term means is really important for risk measurement. And unfortunately, it's something that very few organizations do. It's also one of the key sources of the religious arguments that go on around risk measurement. It's high, no, it's medium, that sort of thing. So qualitatively, this was rated moderate. Minimum, they said 25K. Maybe we didn't have to incur forensics and investigative costs because the person just admitted to it, and there was no need to get in digging around in data. So 25K to replace the employee. Okay. But maybe we did have to do forensics, and so the maximum was 150K. Now, just point out that this analysis was done a few years back when forensics maybe wasn't quite as experienced as it is now. That number might be larger today. So just wanted to point that out. So that's primary loss. And why did that show up again? Oh, the most likely was 40K. Sorry about that. So some forensics, but not having to spend too much on that. Secondary loss. This is fallout. Okay, this is the reputation damage, the legal, regulatory costs, those sorts of things. And so, since we're talking about customer data, we're assuming that, if the event occurs, we're going to have to incur secondary losses of some sort. And this node we're on in the model is secondary loss event frequency. You can think of it as the probability of secondary loss occurring. And we're going to say, again, because we're assuming that this is customer data, if it's compromised, we're going to have to notify people and that sort of thing. So very high. And again, very easy quantitatively, we're going to just say 100%. Now, I know some people who do fair analyses when they're doing secondary loss event frequency, they don't assume 100%, even in a situation where it's customer information. It'll be in the high 90s%, but sometimes they have rationale that come from discussions with their lawyers very often that says, well, under these circumstances, it might not be 100% of the time, and that's fine. So this is a more conservative, more pessimistic estimate than they might use, but again, it doesn't have to be 100% if say your legal team or their other rationale that suggests maybe it isn't 100%. Now, secondary loss magnitude, this is where most of the pain typically exists in loss events in our world. But we have to add, again, some rationale, something to help us sort of understand how to put numbers around this. So we're going to assume that a minimum, in order for this to be an event in this scenario, at least one customer record has to have been compromised. And in this scenario, this group that did this analysis said most likely 20 records and maximum 100 records. Now, the reason why they didn't say, well, all million records or however many were in this database or in this customer base is because they assumed these are insiders who are trying to lay low and not get caught. Another key component is they couldn't do a data dump. None of these accounts had that privilege. They had to access the records one at a time, right? And so that's a noisier process, more time-consuming process. Therefore, they arrived at these numbers for the number, to set the number of records, okay? And then the costs that we'll see here in a minute include notification costs for, the customers whose data had been compromised, implementing credit monitoring, legal defense, et cetera, all that good stuff. The usual suspects. And qualitative, they said moderate. Now again, that some of you may go, really moderate? Because we've got these legal defense and other sorts of things. Again, with this limited number of the assumption regarding the smaller number of compromised records, the numbers, again, as this organized defined moderate, because they went through the exercise of saying, here's what low, moderate, and high means from an impact perspective. This landed in moderate. And they said minimum $100. If they're just one customer record, right, we're going to have notification costs and that sort of thing, but we're not going to, it's very unlikely to incur much else, right? Maximum 500K. Now, again, this was done a few years back. It might be higher today, even for a small number of records like this. And it may be different in Europe than it is in the United States as well. So, but they said most likely is 17K, right? Around that 20 customer record count number. Okay. So having done that, let's look at sort of the qualitative picture here, right? So here's the ontology, the FAIR model. And we said threat event frequency was low. We said vulnerability was very high, which means our loss event frequency is low. Now, some of you might go, really, shouldn't it be sort of an average between low and very high? And if you recall from that review of NIST 800-30 that I did in the last session, the loss event frequency is bounded by the threat event frequency. It can't be higher. Your loss event frequency can't be higher than the threat event frequency. So that's what we're seeing here. Even though vulnerability is 100%, well, we can't have a loss event frequency higher than the frequency of attacks, right? So that's where that comes from. We had moderate primary loss. We had very high secondary loss event frequency, but moderate secondary loss. And so we see same sort of deal here as on the other side. And then the question becomes, how do you combine two moderates? Is two moderates high or is it still moderate? Well, again, one of the big challenges with qualitative measurements is that can be really hard to deal with. So in this group, they felt that because it was towards the low end of moderate in both primary and secondary loss, that the overall loss magnitude was expected to be moderate. So we have low loss of infrequency and moderate loss magnitude, all right? Is that low or is it moderate? Again, they had the discussion. They brainstormed through that and decided it was low. Okay, so you can see here some of the challenges qualitative. They're not insurmountable, but they exist. And if we don't deal with them, if we don't recognize and deal with them, again, the odds of getting our qualitative measurements right goes way down. But if we crunch the numbers, and this was done, using this FairU application, which is free to use on the internet. It's out there. Go out and log in and use FAIR to your heart's delight. Now, one thing I will warn you about, this is a education and training website. It does not have enterprise class security, so don't use the same password when you log in there that you use, at work, and don't put really sensitive information in there, right? Don't explicitly detail out all the details about the risks that you're analyzing, okay? In case someone were to compromise it, right? Just use sort of high-level descriptions and if you just have numbers in there, nobody's going to learn anything useful from just the numbers. So, but it can still be a useful tool for kicking the tires on FAIR, so to speak. Okay, so that was the first one, right? And we got, there are the numbers. Minimum, we might, the loss exposure might be 0. It could be 1.5 million, but on average, annualized is 137K. And so let's look at that second scenario, the weak intrusion detection, right? Again, we have to scope it. So it's customer information again, right? Now, this is weak intrusion detection. It could be any number of scenarios affecting, say, critical operations rather than customer information. But we have to be explicit. We have to choose something to be analyzing. What are the threat actors, cyber criminals?
Jack, may I ask a quick question? Or do I need approval from you, Ivan? Okay. So you just mentioned it again, that in order to provide a solid analysis, you need to make choices, right? You need to be as specific as possible. I agree, absolutely. The result is, on the other hand, that there's a huge amount of possibilities of use cases. So stepping back from starting the risk analysis, can you highlight a little bit more about the selection process of these use cases?
Yeah. So there are a number of ways to go about it. I actually have a blog post series out on the FAIR Institute website that steps through how to sort of enumerate the different scenarios your organization may be subject to, and then sort of triage them down to those that you're going to analyze more thoroughly, right? Because you can get analysis paralysis can strike when you first get into this, right? But there are ways to approach that reasonably and quickly that can help you avoid that and sort of focus on the things that matter most. So I can send you guys a link to that blog post series. If you'll send me a note after we're done here to remind me to do that, I'll send you a link that you can share with everyone. So
okay, great. And what departments would you typically work with in this stage?
Very often legal compliance. Audit tends to like to have a say in such things. And if you have an enterprise risk manager or enterprise risk program, I would include them as well. And you can talk with the IT folks and the business folks as well, because they'll have thoughts. But there can be, there's a balance between getting the right perspectives on the table and the right people in the room and having too many cooks in the kitchen. Yeah. So you need to sort of balance that. And there isn't a science to that I know of. So I think to some degree it's trial and error, but it doesn't take long to sort of pin things down for your organization.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great question. All right, so what type of action again? Well, it's cyber criminals, so we're going to assume malicious. Yeah, they might break something accidentally, but it'd be in the process of doing something malicious. So what type of event? Again, it could be any of these: confidentiality, integrity, or availability. We have to choose one. We're going to say confidentiality. And so the loss event scenario, the risk we're analyzing, we're measuring, is expressed there. Okay. So now we know what we're measuring. And I can't say it enough. This is just as important for qualitative measurement as quantitative. And it's something that very, very, very few people in our profession do when they're doing qualitative measurement, which is one reason why our qualitative measurements are so bad. Okay, so same process here, threat event frequency. How often we think, this event might happen, right? Well, we talked with the SMEs in the organization, and we had data from compromised systems at the perimeter, say phishing attacks that had succeeded, and determining what percentage of those phishing attacks were actually targeting the organization versus, say, the end user and trying to get their bank account information, that sort of thing, because it was very different. So had those conversations with subject matter experts in this organization, and we arrived at these estimates. And we're not going to go through the qualitative measurement on this one, but we ended up with these measurements. Right? One in every 10 years, maximum 5 a year, which again was sort of a paranoid high value, but the maximum value you can exercise a little paranoia with, that's fine. It's the most likely value then that introduces, reason, that sort of counters that paranoid tendencies in our measurements. So we said, or they said, every other year, roughly, is the most likely value. And so our susceptibility to this, okay. So, breaching the perimeter we're assuming, all right, back to this for a second. We're assuming that the bad actors have breached the perimeter and are moving deeper. That's what these numbers are representing, right? So what's our susceptibility to, if they're able to breach the perimeter, what's our susceptibility internally to them rummaging around and doing dastardly things, right? Well, we're assuming that if they've breached the perimeter, they have a higher probability of getting at legitimate accounts, which makes it, more difficult to resist their further attempts, in some cases, even to detect their attempts. So we're saying our vulnerability, someone who's breached the perimeter for this organization we're talking about here, was pretty high. We say at least 3/4 of the time, they're going to be able to pull off this, theft of customer data if they get a solid foothold on the perimeter. And it may be much higher than that, right? So if, with that side of the model, the threat event frequency and susceptibility taken care of, now we're into loss magnitude. And here we have internal response efforts, the costs associated with that. Now, not all organizations include this value in their estimates for loss because they think of that as sort of a sunk cost, people's time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's sort of an analytic assumption that organizations are free to make, as long as everybody understands that that's there and not included. There's nothing wrong with that. Forensics and investigative costs are included, and the numbers that they came up with for that was this: minimum of 50K, maximum of 500K, most likely of 100K. Now, again, some people are thinking, boy, that seems low for a compromise of customer data. Well, keep in mind that that's just the primary loss. We haven't got to the fun part, the secondary loss. So secondary loss event frequency. Again, this one is easy in this scenario because we're saying in order for this scenario to have materialized, at least one record has to have been compromised. So we're going to incur some secondary costs notifications and that sort of thing. And so that sets a lower bound, and which of course then raises the question of what the higher bound might be. So, but for frequency, we've got 100%. Now on loss magnitude, it gets a little more interesting. Minimum 1 customer record, most likely 1 million customer records, and maximum all the customer records. I don't remember how many there were, but there were millions. And so with those as sort of the distribution of compromised records, all right, they thought through notification costs for each of those values, credit monitoring, legal defense, and customer churn. And customer churn is an example of reputation damage, right? Again, many people think that reputation damage can't be measured. That's completely wrong. You can absolutely measure reputation damage. It materializes in customer churn, lost future revenue. It's the cost of capital. It's maybe difficulty in retaining or hiring good employees, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of ways damaged reputation materializes, all of which can be estimated if you're talking to the right people in the organization. So it could be stock price, if it's a publicly traded organization, that sort of thing. So the values they came up with here, minimum of 5,000 if it was just 1 customer record, right? Maximum 100 million and most likely 1 million. Okay, so some bigger numbers there. And so here we see sort of the range. The minimums still could be 0, right? Because these are annualized frequencies, and without getting into the details regarding stochastic sort of simulations and that sort of thing, just recognize that the result can almost always still be 0, but it's probably not. And so your averages and maximums become more meaningful. And so when we compare those two scenarios, here's what we get. And we showed that in the last session. And so this is where those numbers came from. So, this was a use case of, all right, prioritizing between two scenarios, okay? But there's also the use case of, well, cost-benefit analysis. All right, now we know how much risk is associated with that more risky scenario, all right? What do we do about that? And can we find a cost-effective solution, right? How do we defend, say, a request for additional resources? And so for improving the intrusion detection in this organization, they thought it was going to cost about $750K in the first year, and additional $300 to $500K annually thereafter. How would they defend that to management? What does that look like? All right, so if we improve detection, what actually happens, against the model here? So let's look at that. So loss event frequency doesn't change. We're improving detection, right? This is, we've still got a bad guy in the organization rummaging around, right? So we still have something we have to wrestle with. It's just a matter of how quickly can we find them, right? Can we limit the time they have to dig around and find the pot of gold, right? So that means we're talking about loss magnitude changes primarily, right? We're able to reduce primary loss because we can detect things earlier, and maybe we don't have to apply forensics across as many systems and that sort of thing. Secondary loss event frequency goes down because we may intervene before they get to the customer data, right? So we can affect the frequency of fallout, or the probability of fallout from an event. And secondary loss magnitude goes down because if they've found and exploited fewer records, then all the costs associated with that are lower than if they find time to find all the good stuff. All right. So the other thing I want to point out here is the minimum and maximums. We'll see that here in a chart. the minimum and maximum values for all the estimates we did earlier on this scenario don't change. It's the most likely value. So let's see what that looks like. So this is a graph of the scenario before we implement any sort of improvement, right? So we have a maximum value and a minimum value, and then the most likely value. And we can see that because without good intrusion detection, they have time to rummage around and much higher probability of finding the good stuff. But I mean, we might trip over them on day one before they find anything, and so the loss magnitude might be 0, okay? But it's probably not going to be 0. We're probably not going to trip over them. So, so this is what that curve looks like. If we implement this strong detection capabilities, this is what it looks like. Again, minimum and maximum don't change. They might get lucky on day one or in the first instance, or maybe the laptop that they, or desktop that they compromise has a dump of the, all the customer records, and so the maximum loss is realized. But probably, because we're able to detect them more quickly, the most likely value is much lower. And so when you're doing the quantitative analysis on that, you get, you get that reduction in risk. And so this was before state, before we implement improvements. This is the after, all right? And we can see that it's gone down quite a bit. And if you sort of risk reduction per dollar spent, we're at maximum reducing risk $133 for every dollar we're spending on improved intrusion detection. Most likely $14 of risk reduction per dollar spent, which is still a good investment, right? And so that gives you an idea of sort of how you can go after this cost-benefit analysis approach as well.
So, Jack, we have a very pertinent question here. Yep. How do we convince management that such a risk range is not basically guessing? Do we have any advice for this? And I think, in a way, it goes back to what we discussed at the beginning. It's,
no, it's a great question. No, it's a great question. And when you start doing these analyses, the first time you take a quantitative analysis to executive management, you should expect them to be curious. And that's not a bad thing. If you've done your homework, right, it can be a little nerve-wracking, but if you've done your homework, you'll come out of that meeting with more credibility than you had going into it, okay? And that's been true with everyone I've spoken. It's certainly been my experience as a CISO using this for years. Expect them to be curious, but be prepared for that, right? Tell them what the scope of it was, where you got your data, what your assumptions and rationale were, and that sort of thing. And let me remind you too that most executives have, many executives at least, have been through an MBA program and are familiar with this process of ranges and distributions and using stochastic Monte Carlo sorts of analyses. And if you tell them, again, that you've clearly scoped it, what you've measured, the data you got, we got our loss data regarding legal costs from Bob in legal. They're going, oh, okay, yeah, that's who I'd go to for that too, right? So it's a matter of being prepared, expecting the curiosity, but welcoming it and learning from it, because they may ask questions that you have to go back and go back and do more homework on and come back, find a result, that sort of thing. Nothing wrong with that. That is completely normal and natural. And the goal here is to help the organization make the best decisions it can, given the information it has available, which is never perfect, okay? And so bottom line, wrapping up my long-winded answer to that good question is be prepared, right? And look forward to it as a learning opportunity for them, for you, and as an opportunity to increase your credibility in their eyes. And again, that's always been my experience. So Yeah, and you can point them in direction of like Douglas Hubbard's works and my work and published works. Tell them you're using a industry standard model that's has certifications around it and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of information out there that can put their minds at ease. So, and certainly if any of you go out there and are preparing to do this and have sort of, you want to make sure you're prepared before you take that step, you know, ping me and we can have a conversation about it. I can try to help you.
Sure.
Solid footing.
Jack, maybe a follow-up question on that one.
Yep.
What is your experience with non-profit organizations or organizations that are less driven by profit, and the difference in how they approach it and utilize the model?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, government organizations and nonprofit tend to very often will say, well, we're really not concerned about the numbers. So, yeah. Now, the probability side, yeah, that's still a numbers game that they can't claim to not be subject to. It's the loss magnitude side, and you know, the government organizations I've worked with on this, I've said, do you have economists in your organization? And they all do, right? The economists are there because the organization cares about numbers, right? And they can absolutely tell you what, you know, they can give you good ranges and distributions for this sort of outcome or that sort of outcome. They probably would welcome the conversation. They probably find it fascinating. So the organizations do in fact care about numbers, but if that's not where you want to start, you can still do this qualitatively, but you still need to scope, right? Clearly, you still need to define what low, medium, and high means, right? That sort of thing, in some sort of tangible and sort of as objective as possible way. So you don't have to do it quantitatively. There are a lot of limitations to qualitative, but there's also a way I've come up with recently specifically for government and these sort of mission-focused organizations to do this. Maybe that's a separate session we set up in the future. I haven't written on it, but yeah, if someone's really curious about that, we can have a conversation. So.
Great.
I can certainly think of some other very interesting scenarios when it comes to NGOs where, for example, a loss of data that doesn't really look big can equate to a loss of life, which is amazing. So people really need to think about what their cases are, and they need to put into context, obviously, what the boundaries and what the tolerances are before they embark onto something like this.
Yeah, and everybody's going to say, well, the loss of even one life is intolerable. Okay, so how much are you willing to spend to make that happen?
Exactly.
Right? No organizations. Our choice of insurance policies, there's 100 different ways to measure the value of human life, and we do it all the time, right? For example, if you were buying a new car and there was this really cool, promising sort of security measure available on the car, but it was going to cost another $100,000. You're going to spend it? Probably not. Well, you just put a price on your life. Okay. So yeah, it's a really fun, interesting, deep topic, but yeah, it's
absolutely. Another interesting thing maybe we can touch upon, Jack, is people frequently struggle with defining and identifying assets. I find that to be a very interesting and hot topic always. Maybe you could share a bit about that.
Yeah. Most organizations don't. I don't know that I've ever entered an organization that really had a good handle on their crown jewels. Could really say, these are the systems, and it's just these systems that have, you know, our sensitive information or that are critically important. You know, I think from a criticality perspective, organizations may be a little bit better because of their disaster recovery sorts of efforts. But even then, a lot of times that's out of date and not what it needs to be. But yeah, I mean, organizations will always have blind spots. If you, that's true whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative measurements. And so it's not just a quantitative thing. And so if you're waiting for perfect information about your crown jewels before you measure anything, before you measure risk, that makes no sense whatsoever. You have the data you have, and it's undoubtedly has gaps in it, right? And, do your measurements, continually look for ways to improve the quality of your data, your awareness of crown jewels and whatnot, recognizing that that's an opportunity to refine your data. But, no organization is going to have perfect data in that regard. And yet they still have to make decisions about prioritizing and cost justifying security measures and that sort of thing. So make the best use of the data you have, and continually look for ways to improve that data.
Absolutely. Again, worth adding here that maybe we as professionals don't necessarily always think in the right context. So again, going back to that asset statement, don't always think necessarily in a context of there is a server X or workstation Y. The asset can be an entire business process. The asset can be an entire factory for that matter. And I guess this is what people need to start grasping to start doing things like this.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. I'm so glad you brought that up. So a business asset can be a business process. It can be a facility. It can be, of course, the humans when they're not messing things up. So asset can mean many things to many people. And that takes me back to having clarity on what it is we're measuring in the first place, right? And it's something that as a profession, we are not good at. We've never been good at. And until we are good at it, our risk measurements are going to just suck. And so it's clarity, clarity, clarity. If you don't have clarity on what you're measuring or what something means, then all bets are off regarding the quality of your measurements. So.
Thank you very much.
So wrapping this up, decisions are always based on priorities, and priorities are based on comparisons, which are always based on measurements. And if we don't have good measurements, then all the rest is a crapshoot. We have 3 fundamental requirements. We have to have clarity, as I've been pounding on. We have to have an accurate model. FAIR is an accurate model. We have to have data, and there will always be uncertainty. We're never going to have perfect data. We just have to faithfully account for and communicate that uncertainty when we're doing our measurements. And how effectively we manage risk is a function of all of this. And FAIR is really useful in that regard. So there we go, with 1 minute to spare.
Fantastic. We haven't got any more questions in the chat. I guess we did cover those that were there and successfully. Obviously, for the audience, please let us know if there is anything else you would like us to try and cover. If not, certainly, I think we can do what we did last time. We can follow up on those questions or the new questions for that matter offline and provide those answers. Jack was incredibly good to us last time around, and we did like a big Q&A offline. Otherwise, that was afterwards that was sent to people. So certainly there's that option. Let's try not to abuse it, but it's there. And at the end, I would really like to thank you, Jack, again for being with us. Another fantastic session. I guess another great introduction to the risk to the world of cyber risk quantification, I must say, because yes, this is a great way to kind of peek through the very small hole and to just open that door ever so slightly. But it's such a vast area that that really requires a bit of experience, but before all, it requires people to embrace it and just go down that road. And my only advice is we really can't do without it. For way too long, we lived in this world where, yes, we were kind of trying to do everything in our 4x4s or 5x5s, and it's just wrong.
Well said.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you all. Have a lovely rest of the day, and see you in the next one.
I need to
yeah.
promote the next
Sorry.
session. Also from me, Jack, Ivan, thanks again. It was another great presentation. I'm actually working with Luke, a colleague of Jack from FAIR Institute, on the training part, and I'm negotiating a discount for Tribe members. So putting the pressure on you now, Jack, again. Once we have it, we will send it over. So if you're interested in training, just wait for a couple of more days until I've got the discount code and the schedule from Jack's colleague at FAIR Institute. Next session, Cyber Resilience Manifesto. And Ivan, we did not plan this. You can confirm. The last discussion I had with Francesco was actually when he just got out of a meeting on taxonomy of assets. This discussion, we're going to debunk some of the terminology discussions on cyber resilience. Just like with you, Jack, what is risk and what is not risk? We're going to talk about what is cyber resilience and what is it not. It's not cybersecurity, to give that up front. And one of the topics that we're going to talk about is actually overspending on crown jewels and underspending in high-value targets. So definitely a very interesting one to attend. It's not online yet, but it will be in a couple of weeks, and you will all receive that invitation as well. That's it from me. Ivan, now you may close. I'm sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. My apologies for trying to close it before you. Wim, again, thank you all for attending. Wim, thanks for organizing. Jack, yet another fantastic session. So thank you so much. And for everybody else, looking forward to meeting you in one of the next sessions.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.